Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My good friend and former colleague, Marta, has agreed to come do a presentation for us today. We worked together at Bugaboo, where she was a Scrum Master for some of the development teams we had. And she's going to be talking about user stories, I guess. So, yeah, I don't know what else I can say. The floor is yours, Marta.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. Or maybe first of all, a little bit about the agenda. It's very simple. Well, at first I have a presentation prepared and I will base what I'm talking about on it. It's some visual, but it's mostly aid for me so that I don't forget any important points to mention. In the meantime, there will be breakout sessions, or I will ask you to do some work in the group. So it's only me talking. That would be quite boring, I think. I assume it will take around an hour, and then the last 20 minutes are reserved for your questions. If you have any doubts or you're curious about certain subjects, we can dive into it then. Although if you have questions earlier and you're afraid that you will forget them, please share them in the chat so that I keep them in mind and I can read them later. And just to check, do you all can hear me fine? Yep. Okay, I see some thumbs raised, so that's a good sign. So I will share my screen. Let's see if you can see it. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
yes.
That is perfect. So maybe, well, Jonathan already introduced me a little bit about myself. Like he mentioned, we work together in Bugaboo. I am a Scrum Master with around 3 years of experience. Before that, I was a part of Scrum team as in development team. So I was working as a QA, mainly busy with automation. Also had a small team of very great QAs that I worked with. I am a certified Scrum Master, although that on its own doesn't say a lot, but hopefully that session will be good. And I really like sharing knowledge. I believe this is one of the perks of my job and one of the most important things that I can do for the teams. So it's very nice to be here and thank you for having me. I currently work in a company called Ice Mobile. We're working with brand loyalty. And I'm originally from Poland. I've been in Amsterdam for around 4 years, living in Zaandam, specifically with my partner. Okay. So user stories. Let's start maybe a little bit higher, as in user stories are part of product backlog. And product backlog is actually what is a very important entity for teams that are working with Scrum or working with Agile. I know that you're not really using sprints that strictly, that's fine, don't worry about it. What is product backlog? Well, product backlog is everything that needs to be built for a product. So this is really a place in which product owner, but not only product owner, should gather all the requirements for the product that is being built. And that should be the sole source of truth for that product. So you should have one product backlog for one product. That is quite simple. Now you see a pyramid here that is actually a product backlog iceberg, although it looks more like a triangle, but it is an iceberg, just imagine it. And what happens on top of that iceberg is you have user stories there. We usually have them on the top of product backlog because those have the highest priorities and they're the most details. The further in the product backlog we go, the less details we will have. Hence, we may not have user stories, we may have epics, we may have themes, and those, they don't have requirements formed in the detailed manner. There may be some uncertainties there, but that is fine. Product backlog is an entity that is, let's say, alive, so it changes dynamically, and this is where user stories come in. User stories are a very good way of expressing product backlog items because they really allow us for a lot of changes, replanning, reprioritizing, adding details, even deleting them, changing their place, everything that we want to do. And sorry, just changing the slide here. And this is probably something that you've seen. This is a template of a user story, right? I think this is the most popular one. It says ESA, type of user, I want something, so that something else happens. As you can see, it's a very simple template. And this is because a user story is supposed to be simple. Now, it's not that template has to be used, it's merely a hint or a suggestion that you could use this template when writing user stories to make it more easy for yourself to see what elements should be in it. But you, of course, don't have to. If you Google user story templates, you will get loads of them, and maybe some will be more suitable for your product and for your company than others, and that is fine. But as you can see, the first place in this template has a user. And that is actually the crucial thing in the user story, because it is an item that exists to express something that is desired by a person that will be using our product. So if you look at user stories versus, let's say, traditional documentation or traditional requirements, in traditional requirements, you would have a lot of things written down, right? It would be very detailed, and in Waterfall, there's an attempt to gather all requirements before we actually start working on a product or on a project. In Scrum or in Agile, more broadly, we say that's not possible. It's not going to happen. We can't know everything up front, and things are going to change. Some things are going to become obsolete, and that is fine. But what we do know is that we are delivering something for someone, and that someone is the focus of our work. If we deliver the most beautiful thing, but people are not going to use it, well, it's not a success, right? So the user has the priority, and user usually wants something to happen with our product, with our software, so that he can perform an action or, let's say, gain certain benefit. So in more details, and to recap a little bit, user story is a small estimable chunk of work. Small, it's relative. Like everything is relative in Scrum. User story size is also very relative. Usually for teams that are following sprints, we say that user story is something that can be delivered within one sprint, not longer. I heard from Jonathan that you not necessarily strictly use sprints, and that's fine. Then small for you may mean what you agree on. Let's say that you say, no, for us, it would be the best if user story would be delivered within a week. And that is great, but then it's something that you should agree on and really follow through. That helps, because if user story gets too big, it gets murky, it's really difficult to be transparent about your progress or lack of progress if you have impediments. So that's the first thing about it, small. Second thing, it delivers value. So user story is something that someone should want. And now by user, I don't mean necessarily your external user, so a person that pays for your product. As developers, as product managers, project managers, product owners, managers, team leads, you can all be a user. That's fine. Both external and internal users are very important. It's just that the user story should deliver a value for that user. Let's say that you're a project manager, for example, and you're running projects and you don't really know which chunks of functionality are used by your customers and which not. So you're asking developers to build a software that will allow for testing the usability of, let's say, separate features of your product. And then it's a very valuable story, right? Because it gives you a lot of feedback and a lot of information about the product you're delivering, but your customers that are paying for that product per se will not be using it, but it still has an end user. But in that case, that user is your project manager, and that's also fine. Usually found on top of backlog, again, just to be clear about it, the top of the backlog is where we know more details. We have the highest priority items, and therefore they can be detailed and refined, so they are broke down from epics and from bigger work items to stories. The further down product backlog we go, the bigger those items will be. And perhaps the most important one. So the last but not least, it's really told from the perspective of someone who is desiring the new capability. So you really have to keep in mind the user that you're building things for. Now, why a user story? Why is Agile saying we love user stories? Why not just good old documents or, I don't know, lack of documents, right? That would be very Agile not to write anything down. So the benefit of a user story is that it creates a need for conversation between the development team and product owner. And that is actually the most important, say, feature of a user story. And that means that in the user story, we have a little bit of information of what we want to deliver to our customer. Just a tiny bit, right? Like as a customer who is willing to book my holiday in Spain, I want to be able to see a list of rooms in Hotel X so that I can make a good decision for 2 people going away for a week. That's quite long, but that could be your user story. So it gives you a guideline, a very high level information about what you want to deliver for your users, but it leaves a lot of things untold, right? You still need much more information to start working on it. Like, what's the scope of that user story? What does it mean? The list of the rooms, are we filtering only by dates, number of people, smoking, no smoking? What about error handling, etc.? And all those questions should be a really great points of conversation starting for a developer and a product owner. And that is actually why Agile really likes user stories too, because we value conversation over documentation. And now that's not to say that there shouldn't be a documentation in Agile work, because the code itself, if it's written good, is a documentation. We have test case, we have automated testing. If you have any legal requirements for which you need to create documentation, you have that too. But what we want more than anything is flexibility and is a conversation starter. So you sit down together during the refinement, during the planning, after planning. You have a product owner who is available to the team in case of questions, and you discuss. And what happens there, a lot of requirements that people didn't think about before are emergent during the conversation. So we also do not assume that the product owner coming to the team knows everything about what needs to be delivered. A lot of times, team will think about edge cases, about scenarios that the product owner didn't account for. So that is really good for getting those different perspectives and getting as much information as possible, because then you really get the quality product. And what else? It's a very small item, like I said, so it can be quickly changed, reprioritized, deleted, moved in the backlog. So it's a very, let's say, very lightweight item that you can play around with easily if needed. So to recap on that, again, user story, independent. Don't think I mentioned that. Independent in the user story means that it can be delivered on its own as one working item, and you don't need additional tasks, additional stories or other work items that you are using to deliver it. And when you get to done of that user story and you deploy it, or maybe deployment is part of getting to done, then your users should be able to enjoy it basically. And that means independent. You are able to demo it and users are able to use it. Negotiable, again, when product owner comes to the team, when you talk about the scope of the user story, what should be there, what should not, when you dive into the details that will really allow you to work on it, you should be able to negotiate. It's flexible in that sense, so you can say things that are in scope, out of scope. Maybe the user stories, when you discuss it, grows too big and you see that you need to actually make it into 2 or 3 or 4 other smaller user stories to be able to work on it. That's all fine, because it is supposed to be negotiable. It's not in its final state ever. actually, which is a great thing about it because software delivery, a lot of things are dynamic and are changing very fast. Valuable, again, it needs to bring value. I know that sometimes we're all working on tasks that we have to do, but they per se do not bring a independent value to users, right? They bring value to the company. They bring value to the product, perhaps. Maybe it's a bumping up a version of Java that you're working with. And that's very important to do. But from perspective of a user, may not be valuable. So a user story should be valuable for users. Estimable, so clear enough that you can estimate it. And again, estimate is not a commitment, and estimates can also change, but user story should be clear enough that you could hint or forecast how much effort you think it will be. Small, in Scrum, 1 sprint or shorter for teams not using Scrum the way they agree to work on user stories. Could be 7 days, could be 2 weeks, could be 2 days, and testable. So you create something, you can test it. We're talking about automated tests, manual tests, but it should be testable. And that creates acronym INVEST. And I think it's actually a pretty nice acronym because you should really invest in making the user stories good so that your product and your quality can be built upon the state of your product backlog. Okay. Next one. Now a short exercise. Now I will shortly stop sharing my screen, and this is the point in which we will use the breakout rooms or the smaller settings. It's a quite short one. So imagine there are 2 scenarios actually. The first one, imagine that you're developing a login page for a new social platform and you write the user stories to add login and password. That's the first one. The second one, imagine you're a developer who frequently has to debug product you're working on. Maybe there are a lot of support tickets that you're getting, a lot of errors, but the monitoring and alerting are very poor. So right now it takes a lot of work and investigation from your side to actually get to the bottom of the issue that you're facing. And I would like for you to think of both of those scenarios and write the user story for them. And for now, only the user story using the template, that one or a similar template without, let's say, any more detailed criteria right now, but just a template of a story. Is that clear? I will need your participation now. Yay, I know everybody's excited about it, right? It's great.
Super excited.
So, super excited. So if we take into consideration the scenario number 1, so you're developing a login page for a social platform, a new social platform, and you have to write a user story for adding login and password. How would you do it? What would be the user story? Please, not everybody at the same time.
I would start by typing as a.
Yeah, that's a good start.
User.
As a user.
Yeah, what user though? What user are you imagining for that type of product?
A cat lover, because I'm only going to work on a cat social media platform.
Okay, that's great. That's great. If you'd be developing a dog loving platform, that could make some tension between you and the product owner, but oh, when you think about the social platform, it makes it easier to make a user more tangible in a sense. So even sometimes to imagine a person that could be using it. So it could be even yourself, or it could be if you know your target group for a certain social platform, like Jonathan mentioned, a cat lovers platform, that could also make it easier. But okay, let's take an existing one. Let's take Facebook. Say you have to redevelop a login page for Facebook. Who would be your user? and it's fine. It can be enough to say as a Facebook user. But what Facebook user? If you're only adding login and password, are you a new user, an existing user? So there are a lot of things that you can really think about, even for a short sentence like that.
I want some more people to participate. This shouldn't be a conversation just between me and Marta.
Yeah, that would be great.
It can be any type of user, right? Because imagine that you are not registered. If you try to log in, you should receive some kind of error or some kind of message, hey, registering, following that link. So I think the user could be everyone who has access to that page.
Okay, so you would say as any user, new or existing Facebook user, and that's fine. And then the second part of that would be using the template.
If it is login, so maybe it's not new, someone that's already there.
That could be also another scenario, yeah.
So as a Facebook user, I want to put my credentials to access the platform. Maybe. I want to access the platform. This is what I want, no?
Yeah, that's it. You want to access the platform, exactly. So you need to basically type in your login and your password and probably hit enter or something else, and then be able to get in, right? That would be the ideal scenario.
And see the cat videos inside there.
Yeah, see the cat videos. Right? So, in the conclusion, what would a user story like that look like?
It can be understood in many different ways.
That's very true. And that's one of the goals, like I mentioned, of user stories, that it's a conversation starter. Because all the questions that you had are very valid. You said that it should be new or registered user, but your colleague said, no, it should be only a user that's already there because it's a login page, not a registration page. Then you say credentials, we say login, we say password, right? But what does that mean? Do we have any, let's say, security measures for login and password, as in that password cannot be shorter or longer than, it has to have a number or a capital letter or a special symbol, etc., etc. So, but a user story, you can see like from this one sentence that it's a really conversation starter and that it prompts you to ask all the important questions about it. But the thing is, before you can ask those questions, it's good to create a user story, even a very simple one, very basic one, so that you have something to base those questions off of, if that makes sense. That's what I'm pushing for. So how could the user story for it look like? Because it could be very simple, right? As an existing Facebook user, I want to be able to put in my login and my password in the login page so that I can access my profile. And there you have a user story. And it's far from perfect, it's not very detailed, so you have to add a lot of things to it. And maybe from there you will decide that you need more user stories to cover scenarios like what happened for an unregistered user, what happens if I put in invalid password or invalid login, what happens if my internet connection breaks, what happens in many, many, many other scenarios. But a user story is a basis to start talking about what needs to happen for our users. Okay, and the second one. Imagine you are a developer who frequently has to debug product you're working on. Monitoring and alerting are very poor. Write a user story to improve it. So who's the user of that user story?
A developer, I guess.
Yes, exactly, a developer. And what do developer want to achieve?
He wants to work more efficiently. So, I mean, spend less time debugging.
Yeah, indeed. And to achieve that, what needs to be delivered as a part of the story?
there are different things. I mean, we can say just monitoring and alerting systems, but that's probably very broad for a user story. So we'll go for something more detailed, maybe just having detailed logs, so I can go to the point quicker.
Yeah, and that's a perfect user story. Then you'd probably still, talk more about it in the team as how details the logs should be, where, what, how long would we store them, etc., etc. But that, again, you have a conversation starter. And perhaps if you're talking about login, you see also a need to improve other things, because like you said, it's a very broad term. So maybe that shouldn't even be a user story, but that should be an epic. And from that epic, you can create multiple user stories to enable yourself as a user to debug shorter and have that system work in more efficient way. So when creating user stories, always think about who's the user, who am I building that for, and how will they benefit from that functionality? So what's the value that I am delivering, that we are delivering? And like I said, users can be internal, external, there can be many, many, many different users, and that's all fine. But focus on that, focus on the user. Is that clear?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's great. It's a really interesting having a session like that and seeing my own PowerPoint presentation and thinking, are you still there? Are you there? Did you fall asleep? Did you, are you watching cat videos right now? Because Jonathan reminded you about cat lovers. I should have put some cat videos in here too. But that's my learning for next.
If that's hard, try to present a podcast.
Yeah, that's very, that's very true. Okay, and moving on, a short point about definition of ready and definition of done, which can be helpful. So definition of ready helps them realize or make sure that the user story that is prepared is actually ready to be worked on. So aside from using a template and adding a very high level information about what is your user and what is the action and what is the goal of the action that the user will perform, you usually add more information to the user story when you have a conversation with your product owner or your business analyst or whoever helps forming requirements, and that is acceptance criteria, also known as conditions of satisfaction, and probably by many, many, many other names. So definition of ready is something that is very flexible and is very dependent on the team. So this is something that also teams should agree upon, and it can be beneficial if you are, let's say, struggling with knowing what is the user story, or you had multiple instances in which you took a user story in your sprint backlog or just on your board and you started working on it, and then you realized that it's actually not ready and you had to go back to your product owner multiple times for more questions and more information. And it really wasn't a smooth process, right? Because your product owner also is busy with stakeholders and with other responsibilities, so they're not always available. And then you're saying, well, it could actually go better if we have a user story that is really ready to be worked on. And maybe that is time to sit down with your team, have a session and think about what level of detail we need from a user story and what kind of information. So you probably do need acceptance criteria. So you should know how to test a story to make sure that it delivers its goal, right? So for the login page, it could be that if the customer provides their password, doesn't provide the login, they're not able to be logged in and they get an error that your password or login is incorrect. But that's quite detailed, but to have those multiple points to guide you through what is really needed from that user story, and also clarifying its scope. Because for a login and password page, you could say that everything is in scope, right? From incorrect login to registration to all the error handling to caching of information to web to native work to everything, but that would be humongous. That would not be a user story. So sometimes you need to clarify what's out of scope too. And that's definition of ready. I'm not sure if you're already working with it or not. Do you have experience with it?
We have worked a little bit with the definition of ready. We've defined some stuff, but we aren't, I don't know if we're using it yet.
Okay. Sorry, that's intercom.
And it's mostly from a compliance standpoint. So we've worked on defining definition of ready for security issues and PII and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah, the definitions are more in the discussion point at this moment, and we are trying to implement them.
Okay, so that is worthwhile if you're still figuring out how to work with user stories. That could be just some mutual points of agreement. And the same goes for definition of done. And that helps teams know when the work is actually finished and when it's demoable, right? So a lot of times we would have a situation in which a team is working on a user story, on an item, and they said that it's almost done, almost delivered. We can already show it to stakeholders. The small thing, it hasn't been tested, right? Well, that's not really a done story. If it hasn't been tested, you know, you did not really prove that it works. Mm-hmm. You assume so, perhaps added some automated testing when developing because you're using unit testing, but maybe you did not do end-to-end testing, which could be needed in that certain scenario to confirm that that functionality is working with the already existing piece of product, etc., etc. So definition of done is also something to think about. Then you really specify things like all the testing needs to be done. Code is reviewed by a peer or two. We have code coverage of 80% for unit testing. We have added integration testing, etc., etc. So you specify all those conditions, and when those conditions are satisfied, then you as development team can go to the product owner and say, this is done. We can demo it to the stakeholders, and that is then delivered piece of software. And basically, according to Scrum, something that is done is something that is ready to be deployed, ready to be shipped to the customer. So only that state is a really done state of work, not any earlier one. And all the conditions that you need to get to that state should be in your definition of done. Okay. Moving forward.
Just a question about the definition of ready and done. But this is an agreement, and we need to be sure everybody understands and applies this. And how is the best way to communicate and assure we are doing these steps?
Well, there are a couple of ways of doing that. When I make an agreement about definition of done with the team, we usually get all together, meaning the whole of a Scrum team. So myself, development team, the product owner, we write it down. And then, well, we apply it to our work, and in a retrospective or in any point in which we can actually inspect our work, we go back to it. And we see if we really adhere to it. So there's no easy answer, or maybe for code coverage there is, for example, because you can have tools, right, that are monitoring your code coverage, but not all points from definition of done will be that tangible and easy to measure. So it involves trust in the team and inspection in the point in which you can inspect. So demo would be the first one, actually. In front of the stakeholders, you show what you've delivered, and therefore you get a feedback if it's working how it's supposed to or not. And then during retrospective, you can also see and check with the team if they actually did work according to that agreement. And of course, during the work itself, the development team should hold itself responsible. So, you know, do not just let something go without it being code reviewed. Do not just push it without testing. So it's really just the whole team responsibility that's very important in making those agreements, because yeah, this is something the team agreed to, and therefore the team is responsible for delivering it in the agreed form and way.
Thank you.
Okay. And what is a refinement now? What do you think? Now that may be a very simple question, but it does not mean that it's an easy one, if that makes sense. So I would like, yeah, that is my question for you. What do you think is a refinement, or what is needed for refinement, and who should be a part of a refinement? That is a really open question, but what comes to your mind when you think about refining?
I think refinement should be taken in two separate levels. By one hand, at business level, in which you should cover all the business requirements that you need to fulfill in your user story. And another and very important one is the technical part, of course, in which you can, I think, you can divide that story in separate technical tasks, as far as I understand.
Okay. So you would do that during the refinement, that you would divide the story in the task, or you would add the tasks. Okay. And who would be responsible for all that?
That's just not clear for me. Well, the business at business level, I think the product manager should be the head of that negotiation of this refinement. But I think it's not bad for a QA maybe to participate on it. Depends. I'm not really sure about it. And from technical perspective, the team, I think, the engineers, and also the product manager should be there.
Okay, so you see it as a whole level, a whole team session in which you really clarify what needs to be delivered, and you break it down into small, really small chunks of work that people in the team can work on easily. And out of curiosity, do you have agreements on those technical tasks? For example, how long should it or can it take to work on a single task? Did you ever think about it in the team?
Not exactly, because I think refinement is not a session in which you should assign a specific task to someone.
No.
But maybe some cases you could assign some specific task if it requires investigation. For instance, if you need more investigation in the technical side to be able to create a task for that user story, maybe you can assign to someone that investigation.
No,
I don't
sorry,
know if I understand your question.
I think I misquestioned my question. I meant, did you think about, for example, when you create a subtask for a user story, that one subtask should not take more than a day to be worked on? Because that's also an agreement that a lot of teams are making. So there's no assigning, because that's very fluid, right? It can, a task or a story can go to whomever is available. Everybody can be, I don't know, sick, on holidays, or just busy with something else. So there is flexibility there. But a lot of teams that are using technical tasks or subtasks are making those agreements that a single task, and it doesn't matter what kind of task, should not take, for example, a longer than day to be worked on. And if it takes too long, then it's a signal that there is probably an impediment, and the rest of the team during stand-up or any other point when they get together can ask, hey, is everything okay? Can we help you? What's happening there? But that's maybe a little bit of a side point to it. But that could also be a tip on how to make it more transparent when you work on a one user story together. But no, definitely not assign. Any other points about refinements? Okay, I think it is no. Let me go back to the screen sharing. So what are the sort of rules of the refinement? Well, first of all, it's a very important thing to keep on doing with the team. So if you have a product backlog, you should groom it. So take care of it. And that should take up to 10% time of your, let's say, sprint. So if you would work in the sprint 10% of 2 weeks working time, that would be the refinement itself. So it's quite a lot. And a lot of teams think that perhaps it's too much because we have tight deadlines and we have so much work to do anyway, so who has time for that? But it's actually really important because this is the point in which you can clarify your requirements, reprioritize, and during those sessions, there are, you know, a lot of times in which you will realize, for example, that the work item is obsolete and perhaps the market changed and you need to add something else, or you need to completely change your priority based on the work that you have in progress. So refinements are really important. They can also be done ad hoc if something unplanned pops up or you're working on a story and once you've started working on it, you see that it's something entirely different that you expected. So of course, feel free to schedule it when you need it with your product owner or your project manager. Really look at all product backlog. So a lot of times teams go and they refine everything once. You know, a chunk of user stories in one refinement, then a chunk of new user stories in the second refinement. But it's good to just scan the whole product backlog, every refinement. And it's also good to come back to user stories that you previously estimated. And it's something that I like to call toilet epiphanies. So even if you talked about something and it was clear to everybody, you know, maybe 3-4 days after that, you were drinking coffee or doing something totally unrelated to work, and then it hit you, that was actually not a 5 points, but 8 points, because it will be much more complex for us to do. And because of that, it's really good to come back to previously estimated or talked about items and revisit them, see if there are any changes. And of course, aside from refinements, product backlog can and should be groomed and ordered at any other time too. And all that happens at product owner's discretion, who owns the product backlog. But that doesn't mean that the product owner has to do it. It can be delegated to anybody else. And I think it's good if development team is an active participant to that, so that you feel the co-ownership of the backlog and you feel really that you own the process of creating your product. Okay, and now estimations. If you could tell me a little bit about your estimations, I'm really curious to hear from you. How, if, what for?
We don't have any.
You don't have any. Okay. Does it work for you like that? Because maybe it doesn't.
No, the fact is we are creating our teams. The oldest team we have, it's 2 months old. So we are learning to work together, learning about the code we have to create, the structure we already have, the architecture, and then we'll be prepared to estimate. At this time, I see it's too early, but I'd appreciate an advice on how we can do this with small and new teams.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will tell you a little bit about it, although it's a very broad subject on its own and it would deserve its own session. But estimations, we have different techniques of estimating. That's the first point, I think. And teams choose the way they estimate, usually based on previous experiences, knowledge, and skills. And a couple of the ones that are well known, it would be, of course, story points, which tell us about complexity of work. So they take into account all the work that needs to be done for a user story. There are, of course, hours. So there are teams that estimate in time. And some teams, let's say, estimate in real time or overlapping time. So the time that really take with all the meetings and distractions and breaks to deliver the work. Sometimes they choose ideal time. So if you strip the work from all the meetings and distractions, how much time you would actually spend on the user stories. Some teams are working with t-shirt sizes, which is, you know, small, small, large, extra large, medium. So there are many techniques. What is nice is, I think, to see what you have the most experience with and build up on that, because if you already estimated perhaps in your previous job with, let's say, story points, that would be easier to start with than something entirely new. Because the teams are new, would be really nice to have in the beginning or add is a base reference story. So when you in the beginning start to estimate, especially in something that is as abstract as story points, which is, you know, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, these are very abstract numbers, right? It's not something that correlates to, let's say, reality. It's not as tangible as 2 hours of work. You will see, especially in the beginning, that people will have very different reference points, especially if they use story points before. So for someone looking at the same user story, the complexity of work may be 1 point, for the other person, 5 points. So what is nice to have is to look at the stories that you've already delivered, that are already completed, look back on them, and then have a discussion about how many points or how many hours you spend on it, or what t-shirt size it would be, whatever you choose, but look back and find a couple of stories, perhaps one that was really easy, one that was sort of, you know, a standard story size for you, and one that was really difficult, and treat them as your base references. So you have the story A that, let's say, you gave 2 points, story B with 5 points, and then story C with 20 points. And every time you estimate a new story, you can then go back to those base reference story and say, okay, if story B was 5 points, then how much would the story that we're estimating now be? And that is a very good thing, because it really sort of gives you a common base for estimating and makes it less abstract and a little bit more tangible, because you can refer to the actual user stories that you previously worked on before. So if you're not estimated but looking to get into that, that would be the first thing that I guess I would go back to. Go back to our previous stories and see what common base we can get there, discuss it, and then start from that and just learn as you go, really, because that's very you know, experience-based process. And maybe a little bit about halo and bandwagon effects. So you probably, even if you haven't used them before, know about, for example, poker cards for estimating in story points in Agile. And the idea is the team always estimates at the same time, right? So you do the 3, 2, 1, and then everybody puts cards on the table in the same moment. And it maybe looks a little bit funny, but the actual reason for it is that if one person, maybe a senior developer who has more experience than other teammates, puts the number before everybody else, it psychologically influences people. And you don't want that. You want people to really only focus on what they think about the size of the story, and then if those differ, have a discussion about it to reach a common understanding and conclusion. But you don't want people to influence other people's estimates, because that way, well, the judgment will be infected, and perhaps people will be less eager or less willing to speak up if they see that someone more experienced than them set a different number. So these are a couple of tricks. I can send you some articles that are worth reading, I think, when attempting estimation. Do you have any questions about it?
Well, I'm used to poker punctuation, but I've never done this in a remote team. So my question is, do you have any experience on doing this with a remote team?
Yeah, and there are actually remote tools that are created specifically for that. So sort of a remote poker, when you have a screen with remote poker cards, and then you select the card. It's sort of a shared session, so it can be like a Zoom, and then everybody can see other people's cards. So, and those are working actually really good. So real time, you're estimating just like you would be playing physical cards.
Okay.
So I can send you a couple of links to those tools. I think they could be useful.
And the last question is, this is what I'm used to, but maybe the team is more used to other techniques. What's better? Choose something that I'm used as a PM or something that they already did in the past?
Well, because I'm a Scrum Master, my answer will always be take it to the team. So I think before you agree on whether it would be story points or something else, you can have a short meeting, a part of a stand-up or retrospective, when you just answer the question, what do we want to use for estimation? And you may not get it right the first time. So you may check out a couple of ways of estimating, but I would say just agree on it as a team together.
Okay. Thanks, Mark.
No problem. Okay. Yeah, I have another exercise, but I think because we can't use break rooms, I will skip that one for now. And perhaps I will send a follow-up exercise to Carla and Jonathan for those who would want to play a little bit with user stories. But for now, I'll skip that and finish with the roles. So in the Scrum, in particular, we have 3 roles, but that's also being used across other agile frameworks. The product owner, who is responsible for the what of the delivery, so the business side of it, the requirements, and a lot of times that product owner collaborates with project managers or product managers, business analysts, and other functions. Then you have the development team, who is responsible for the how of the delivery. So you have specialists, and those specialists based on the user story, so just detailed enough to start working on, should be able to figure out the solution which they will implement, which makes the most sense considering your current platform, your restrictions, your capabilities, your resources. And the Scrum Master, who in a traditional agile framework would be responsible for the how and the what of the process itself. So that person would be just, say, guiding that you're using a process in the most efficient way to get out all of the process capabilities. And why it's important to remember that, although it's very simple, it's because we all get very busy in everyday work, and that clear division of roles mean that we can all maximize our potential and our engagement in those specific areas. And I think this is something that is very good in Scrum and in Agile, because it really allows you to focus on what is the most important for your role and trust other people that you're working, your team members, to do the same for their roles. And I really appreciate it. And it's all, of course, really, it all really depends how successful you are with it on the values. And the Scrum values are courage, respect, openness, focus, and commitment. And really, I think you could hear it from my presentation that most of the points that I talked about are agreements that you make as a team together. So things that you verbally, sometimes in writing, commit to. And there's no clear way, and there should not be, of controlling whether people adhere to those or not. But what that requires is a trust to your team members, and the trust is a really good foundation on which to build a team. And the team that has trust should be courageous, committed to work, focused, open, and respectful. And I think this is the best way to utilize Agile, is to use those values and express them through things like user stories, definition of done, definition of ready. When you commit to something together and you really give each other opportunity to come through on that commitment and on that agreement. And you inspect and you adapt as a team, but trusting each other that at all times you're doing the best that you can to assure that you deliver a product and you deliver a product of good quality. And to, let's say, finish with, there's some additional reading here, the Scrum Guide, always Succeeding with Agile from Mike Cohn, which has a lot of information about the framework, product backlog, roles, ceremonies, framework, user stories applied, which is really focused on user stories. So for those who, I think in particular, will spend a lot of time preparing them. And Agile product development with Scrum, which really focuses on product development, but it's a very good, let's say, practical guide on how to, and I would also really recommend it. And that's it from me for the presentation part of it. So thank you very much. Now, if you have any questions, we still have time. I'm only 3 minutes over time, so it's a really big success for me.
I've been doing my question during the presentation.
Okay.
So thank you a lot, Marta. Not sure if anyone else have more questions.
This is a broad question, but how do you suggest? As we've already said several times throughout this presentation, you know, we're pretty new with dividing our teams, and there's a lot to go over. You just gave us 4 books we could read that I'm sure we could read at least 100 more. How should we approach the concept of getting started with applying some of these principles and learning the best ways to go? Do we need somebody like you to come teach us everything, or can we learn enough by reading blog posts or you know how do we get started?
I would say experiment. That's the shortest. In ideal world, you would have someone to help you. Obviously, that would take some of that weight off of you because that person would be there to help and guide. But if you don't have a person like that, just start experimenting. Do your first refinement. And if you have some work items that you see are not really user stories, try to make them into user stories. Try to add acceptance criteria. At the same, like I said, gather team, agree on what estimation tool you would like to use, whether users story points or other tool, make some base reference stories so that you can use them for estimation and start building on that. These are really, you know, very basic things. So I think everybody can start, you know, playing around with them. And as you go and you see, for example, that your estimations are maybe, you know, not really as good as you would think, then you go to the retrospective and you take those user stories that you thought would be really simple but ended up being really complex, and you just talk about them. What happened? Why did we misestimate it by so much? What happened there? And you find perhaps an action point to improve that. You say, okay, well, before we do it the next time, we check, I don't know, the legacy code to see if we'll have to do much of the refactoring next time when we estimate, or something along the ways. And you just iterate on that, and hopefully iteration by iteration, you get a little bit better. But I would say just start using user stories, start refining, have retrospectives, start estimating as soon as you can, even if it's really sloppy in the beginning, that's fine, that's how you learn. And if you want, perhaps to make it easier, add a definition of done or definition of ready. Just go for it.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay.
Yeah.
I think that means no. So, well,
All right.
Thank you very much. It was
Thank you,
really a
Marta.
pleasure. I hope it was valuable to you. I will share my contact details, so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. It is always a pleasure to help, so I will respond as soon as I can. And good luck.